Hey everyone, and welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Well folks, today I've got an episode of utterly pointless comparisons for you that I thought I'd never be able to make because the original arcade game is so insanely difficult. I'll be looking at the arcade versus the Super Nintendo versions of Konami's Gradius III. And just so you know, as far as pronunciation goes, I am going to call it Gradius and not Gradius because I think Gradius sounds better. So if that bothers you, you can hit that little stop button you see on YouTube right now, and I'll say thanks for stopping by and giving this a look. First up, here are the specs of the arcade game, at least those that I could find, versus the SNES, while I tell you just a smidge about the game itself. Konami released Gradius III into the arcades in December of 1989 in Japan. The shoot-'em-up, or shmup, genre was essentially at peak popularity around that time. Gradius III had very high expectations after Gradius II was a huge hit, and you might think that Konami, as they so often did, totally rose to the occasion and created a super sequel with Gradius III that would please everybody. And if you think that, well, you're wrong! A lot of fans felt let down by this sequel, which primarily focused on increased difficulty to challenge Gradius II experts. But Konami kind of forgot that not everyone that played and liked the second game was an expert. Gradius III is still fun when it's at its best and looks and sounds good, but the arcade version is riddled with near constant slowdown. That, coupled with the difficulty level in this one, mean that it did not enjoy the same classic status that Gradius II did. Konami decided to release a home version of Gradius III for the nascent Super Famicom/SNES, and magazines had screenshots of the game well before the system even launched. The game came out in Japan in December of 1990 and was a launch title for the system here in the US in the fall of 1991. Expectations were high for Nintendo's new system. And while Konami did a pretty decent job in general, especially with the graphics, music, and gameplay, there was an issue with this version of the game. The issue is that as bad as the slowdown was in the arcade version of Gradius III, it was even worse in the Super Nintendo version. The slowdown was talked about extensively in the magazines of the day, but review scores were still mostly positive. The Super Nintendo version of the game is also shorter and easier than the arcade version, changing some levels significantly and eliminating others entirely. Alright, let's talk about the recording methodology for this one and then we'll get on with it. I played the arcade game on easy, which is still insanely hard, and used some save states throughout. I played the SNES game on normal and I used a few save states here and there on that one also. But that one is a much easier game. I only did it to make sure that timing was as similar as it could be. Now remember, this is all about showing you the games as efficiently as I can. I'm not claiming to be a Gradius III savant. I stink at the arcade version. I've only beaten it a few times. Also, the stage order is quite different in the SNES game, and some stages are shortened, and the boss rush has stuff in a much different order. Now, I'm going to shuffle things to match the arcade version, but I'll put up and leave up on the screen what level each version of the game is on, and what number boss of the boss rush each game is on. Now, we'll also note that each version counts their levels very differently. I might do a separate video on the SNES version later that shows everything from it in its proper order. Alrighty, with all that out of the way, let's get on with it. And we are underway. You can see the title screens are much different. We get this awesome artwork in the arcade version of the game, while we get sort of a plain Starfield in the Super Nintendo. Here for the weapon select, when we go in edit mode, the choices are quite a bit different, especially in the back half when you get from the options and beyond. And then this is the standard game. So for the arcade version, it runs at a higher resolution. It's 320 by 224, whereas the Super Nintendo is 256 by 224. It looks like Konami used the same graphic for the ship, but it looks stretched out on the Super Nintendo here right now because of that resolution difference. It's kind of like when companies would take games made for the Genesis and then do a port to the Super Nintendo. They would use those graphics, which, because of the lower resolution in most Super Nintendo games, look stretched out. Now, I will say that Konami did not just take all the graphics from the arcade game. It seems they used some graphics for certain things, and then they redid a lot of them. And as you're going to see here, as we get into the main first stage area, these things look very different. So the desert sands and everything on the Super Nintendo are a little bit more saturated, and we have another background layer on the Super Nintendo that's not there in the arcade game. On the arcade, you're going to see, even though I'm playing on easy, there is way more enemy fire on the arcade version than there is in the Super Nintendo one. And here we can see the first sand dragon emerge on the Super Nintendo one, and it looks a lot different than they look in the arcade game. It's a lot more scaly, and it looks like the dragon that we would see in Salamander/Life Force. And what you are going to see here on the arcade one is those sand dragons look a lot different. They look like they're either made of sand or covered in sand. Looks like they're made of sand because of the way they explode, I guess. And again, I really do like how in the Super Nintendo version, the sand looks a little bit more, I don't know, wind-blown than it does in the arcade one. And that extra background layer is also really nice. You know, it adds a little bit more depth that's missing from the arcade one. But the Starfield in the arcade looks a lot better. As far as the music goes between these two games, they sound a lot different, even though the songs are mostly the same. There's a few different ones in each version. And it's hard for me to just pick and say one of them is entirely better than the other. The use of PCM in the arcade game for things like orchestra hits is really good. And I think most of the music probably sounds better in the arcade version of the game, but the Super Nintendo soundtrack is still pretty nice. The only thing I really don't like about it is there are a lot of samples that feel like they're just too short and cut out too fast, and it gives it just sort of a weird vibe. And you almost feel like sometimes a weird pressure in your ear when a sound starts and stops too fast. I don't know. Maybe that's the musician in me, but it really bothers me. And now, as we come up to the first boss in each version of the game, you're going to see they are quite a bit different, even though they look similar. In the arcade version, we've got these spiders that come down one or two at a time, and they make web lines. Meanwhile, in the Super Nintendo one, we've got a bunch of these little squiggly things, and the stuff that the big spidery boss thing shoots out that explodes into projectiles works quite a bit differently in both versions of the game also. And this is one of those bosses that's super annoying because you can only really get a couple of hits in. It doesn't even really seem to matter which weapon you attack it with. But anyway, it doesn't matter. That's the old boss. He's dead now. And you can see I left the stage numbers up, and I'm going to keep them up for the entire game, because while things are the same for the first 3 stages, they're going to diverge a bit after that. So it's going to be helpful to see what point we are in the arcade version versus which point we're at in the Super Nintendo one. And I am going to shuffle things around in the Super Nintendo to match the arcade version. So the arcade will always stay in order, and then the Super Nintendo, we will show things at the same time they appear in the arcade game. The only exception is there is one level that is exclusive to the Super Nintendo version, which we'll watch full screen. There are a few levels that are exclusive to the arcade version, which we will also watch full screen. Alright, anyway, here is Stage 2, our Bubble Zone. And this one, I really do like the arcade soundtrack way better than the Super Nintendo one, but it still sounds okay in both. Now again, in the arcade, we've got sort of this more muted color palette, and things are more saturated in the Super Nintendo port of the game. So, I think the colors are probably a little bit better in the Super Nintendo, but I don't know, I think I might have liked something a little bit between sort of the lighter faded gray of the arcade one versus the more bluish hue in the Super Nintendo one. If I have any of those colors wrong, I apologize, but remember, I am partially colorblind, so some things look a little weird to me. And you can see the slowdown is really in effect here in both versions of the game. And if you're only seeing Arcade Gradius 3 for the first time, you might not know that the slowdown was so bad in it. But it is really, really bad. And that is very strange, considering this game uses not one, but 2 Motorola 68000s, each clocked at 10 megahertz. I'm not sure why the game has such tremendous slowdown with that kind of processing power behind it. It doesn't look like anything that should be taxing the system in that way. On the Super Nintendo, it is famous for its slowdown, which at times will get worse than the arcade. And we will see things where, frame rates are dropped in certain parts in addition to slowdown in order to just help the Super Nintendo one keep up. And it is worth noting, before I get a million comments about this, I am fully aware of the SA1 patch or version that's available for the Super Nintendo that removes the slowdown. But I want to show this to you as it existed when it came out and when it was new. I might take a separate look at the SA1 version versus the regular version sometime in the future.
Destroy the eye.
Another thing I will note here about the weapon loadouts, since I haven't really had a chance to talk about those yet. For the arcade version, you can see I'm using the regular full ship shield, which is sort of the shield that originated in Salamander, while in the Super Nintendo one, I'm using the reduce option that makes your ship small. While that one is in the arcade one too, you might be wondering, well, why didn't you use that in the arcade one? The answer is, in the arcade one, it makes your ship smaller, but you don't get any extra hits. It doesn't serve as a shield. In the Super Nintendo, it makes you smaller, and you also get to absorb several hits. So it acts like a full ship shield in addition to making you smaller. And then here's our boss, and you can see I've taken him out in both versions already. As long as you know the pattern on that guy, he's pretty easy to take out. And another thing I'll note here is for these sort of bonus stages that we see between stages in, both versions of the game, they're a bit longer usually on the Super Nintendo, and in the arcade version, they have like 3 different songs that could possibly play. There's one at the start of the game, then there's a different one that plays between some levels, and then there's another one that plays between some other levels. On the Super Nintendo, they only have one version of that. It's the one that in the arcade version sometimes plays between levels. So, again, look at all that slowdown on the Super Nintendo when there's barely even anything on the screen. I don't know why this was this bad back then. Anyway, here comes Stage 3. Stage 3 is insanely long in the arcade version of the game. It is practically 3 levels unto itself, and it is broken into 3 distinct parts. We have this area with the mountains and everything that looks like it's straight out of Gradius 1. We had a similar stage in Gradius 2. And then the second part of the stage in the arcade has us going through sort of this rocky maze. And then the third stage, or third part of the stage, has you shooting through, different stuff, just gunk, and there are rocks behind it. On the Super Nintendo, they only included 2 of those parts. So we only have the main area here. And by the way, this song is fantastic in both versions of the game. One of the best songs in the game. But anyway, going back to where I was. So on the Super Nintendo, we have this part of the stage, and you can see we've got some extra parallax here again. But just look at how many bullets are on screen right now in the arcade version. I mean, there is nothing like that on the Super Nintendo. There are no moments where on the SNES you're going to see yourself completely surrounded by bullets like that. The arcade one is relentless. On the normal difficulty in the arcade, the bullets, if I remember right, are a little bit faster. It's been a while since I tried playing it that way. And that there's not even that big a difference between easy in the arcade and normal. I just picked easy to try and give myself the best shot of finishing this game at all, and then also finishing it with the smallest amount of frustration and save states and having to redo things as possible. Now, I will say, for the first 3 stages, maybe 4 of the arcade game, it's normal. You might be wondering, like, oh, I got my, brain wrapped around this. I can play this game. It's not that hard. But, my friends, the second half of the arcade version has some of the most insanely difficult parts of any side-scrolling shooter I have ever played in my entire life, and I have played a lot of them. So you could see I paused this now on the Super Nintendo, and look at all those bullets again in the arcade. But this is the part that's eliminated from the SNES version of the game. So here in the arcade, it's got this exclusive little rock maze here that is just not in the other version. And I do support Konami's idea to shorten this level. I don't even think they made it short enough. With the 2 parts of this level that are in the Super Nintendo one, it still feels too long. I don't know why they felt the need to stick a level this long just smack dab in the middle of the arcade game. Now, one interesting thing about the arcade one is you have a choice to play sort of an easy short game or the normal game. The easy short game ends after, this level. This is the last one. But the quote-unquote easy short game on this one is still, approximately 15 minutes long if you do it that way. That's how long this level is. I mean, it's crazy. The level's not 15 minutes, but combined with, 1, 2, and 3 together, they're about 15 minutes. I mean, there are some entire arcade games that are significantly shorter than that. And the complete playthrough of Gradius 3, by the way, in the arcade, takes almost an hour. And that's, assuming that you don't have any deaths. If you have deaths, it's going to add to that. And another thing that adds to the insane difficulty on this game is if you do die, you don't get continues. So you'll have, how many ships you've gotten, and there's a generous amount, of extra lives and everything. but there are no continues at all. Once your game is over, that's it. You're done. So you've got to really learn, how to play this game and master it and get through it without dying. And death in this one, depending on where it happens, it can be next to impossible to recover. And I know it's not actually impossible, but for most people, it's going to practically be impossible. And in some versions of the game, Konami has included like a little sort of guide that shows you how to recover from just about any checkpoint, but most of the time, it's not something that the average human is going to be able to do. Now in the arcade, we're approaching the third part of this stage, so we'll be, rejoining the Super Nintendo game in progress pretty soon. And you'll see that they're not exactly the same, but they're similar in principle. But before we get there again, look at the amount of bullets on screen in the arcade version of the game here. Now you gotta really, really stay on the ball in this game. There will be times where you just die and think that, hey, nothing hit me. Well, if you go back, if you're recording yourself and you watch the playback, you can find where those things came from. They didn't just magically appear, but it is sometimes extremely difficult to keep track of all the bullets that are moving towards your ship, along with all the enemies that are moving around. And one strange thing is with the force field in the arcade version here, that's, like the one from Life Force, its hitbox is larger than your ship's hitbox. So there are places you can go where, like, you'll touch parts of the background and it'll destroy the force field, even though you don't die for moving your ship there, because your ship's hitbox is smaller. Would have been nice if the hitbox for the shield was the same as the ship, because there are parts where your shield will just get destroyed, particularly in the last level or so, where it would have been really handy to be able to keep the shield, but you're boxed into tiny little areas, and it's really next to impossible to hang on to it. Again, we can see just a ton of slowdown in both of these. You can tell from the super jittery scrolling you see in each, especially on the Super Nintendo here. Now, a nicer thing on the Super Nintendo is these rocks are invincible in the arcade version, while on the Super Nintendo, enough, firepower and you'll destroy them. And you may be wondering why I went with the twin laser rather than the traditional Gradius laser or the Life Force version of the laser. The answer is, for the twin laser, it has a hitbox where it can hit things a little bit above your ship. So because I'm not using a standard double in this one that aims diagonally upward, I took the vertical shot for one level, and you'll see why. It gives you that little bit of extra maneuverability here where you can shoot some of the junk above your ship. So if you get sort of boxed in, like with the regular bullets, you can't really hit above your ship, but with this thing, you can, make another path higher than you if you're very careful with it. Twin laser, I think it also has a slightly higher DPS than the other lasers. More damage per second, but I'd be lying if I said I was positive or that I'd ever actually measured it. I just know that's what people say about it. So maybe people are right, maybe they're not. I'm not sure. Now here on the Super Nintendo, I would say the background here is way more pattern-based, even though there's patterns in both. So it looks a lot more uniform and tiled than the arcade one does. I do like some of the colors, I think, better, especially on the mountains that are in this area. They look a little bit nicer on the Super Nintendo, but the background is way nicer in the arcade. And you can see this little pre-boss fight goes on way longer in the arcade when it just finished. And then we're going to move on. And the boss will be the same here, and it is immediately after we're done with this boss that these games will diverge. Now, even though the boss looks the same, he is tremendously easier on the Super Nintendo one. In the arcade, this boss is a little tough, even with 2 speed-ups. And you can see when it shoots out those middle lasers, like in the arcade, it's not exactly on perfect angles, while the Super Nintendo it is. And if you destroy the eyes at the wrong time and the firepower starts while you're dodging, some of those angled lasers, it can be really tough to dodge them. So you got to hit it just right. And we've almost got him taken care of in both versions here. There he is out on the Super Nintendo. And he's just about done here on the arcade. Boom. Level 3. Finally finished. Yeah, look at that. Almost 16 minutes. So here we have an arcade exclusive stage where we have sort of a Sega-style super scaler 3D maze. And this part is just such extraneous fluff. It really didn't need it at all. It would have been nice to have a break here and maybe just have a section where you get some nice little bonuses and, you know, maybe just a lot, you know, of power-up tokens. Instead, they want you to fly through all these walls, and even though this looks pretty easy, it's real fast and it's easy to smash into a wall. You've got to really pay attention, and you've got to basically move the second you see, you know, wall changes coming from, you know, the angles on those things. If you don't keep up, it'll kill you real fast. Doesn't really hold a candle to Galaxy Force, but hey, it's something a little different, I guess, so there's that. So now in the arcade, this is stage 5. On the Super Nintendo, this is stage 4. And this is going to be the Moai head stage. You know, the Easter Island heads. It's also interesting that the option eaters come out at quite different times in both versions of the game. And here you can see what I was talking about with the Super Nintendo version of these bonus areas before levels start are almost all longer. There's a few exceptions where they're about the same length, but the vast majority of them are considerably longer. You can see there's the option eater out on the Super Nintendo one, and we saved all our options that time. And now we're entering the Moai head stage proper. Now in the arcade we have these pretty thick chunks of rock, and we have these, you know, larger Moai heads that spin around and they spit out the ones that stick to the ceilings and the floors of the other rocks. Now the Super Nintendo one gets rid of those guys that, you know, go through the middle of the level, the ones that spin around spitting out the Moai heads, and the ones that are there, I don't think they look nearly as good as the arcade ones. They look a little weird and awkward. And I don't know, the color doesn't look nice, and when they open their mouths, they look worse. And there's just a lot less going on in the Super Nintendo one here. Watch the arcade game, watch the amount of rings that you see these things shoot out at me throughout this level. You will be, you know, shocked at the difference in some parts. You might have 20, 30 rings going after you in the arcade one. On the Super Nintendo one, maybe at the most you'll see at a time is like 12. So again, Super Nintendo version of this level, dramatically easier than the arcade version. Even with the arcade game in the constant state of slowdown, I mean, some of this stuff is really hard to dodge. And you don't want to get any more speed-ups, because if you get too many speed-ups, you'll end up smashing into the scenery. Especially when you get to a part where there is slowdown versus a part where there's none. It's one of the most annoying and frustrating things that happens in this game. And you can see there's a lot more density of the Moai heads in the arcade one also, just as you're going through sort of the regular platforms that they're mounted on. On the Super Nintendo one, you know, there's much less. And we get through the section with the heads on, you know, these little platforms a lot faster in the Super Nintendo one. You can see they're still going strong here in the arcade, shooting out what my kids love to call onion rings. So those rings are, like I said, they're annoying. If you get into a bad position here, then it is easy to get slaughtered by these things. So you have to be very careful with your ship's positioning, and you got to know when you can dash through stuff and when you have to wait and when it's best to sit back. Alright, so now we're up to the part with the rotating columns, and these things remind me of the Madara boss from Shinobi. Wonder if they were inspired by it. I would have to think to some degree because they're just so similar. It seems odd if they would just be a coincidence and, you know, that wasn't what the developers were aiming for. And again, you can see we have way more of these Moai head columns in the arcade game than we do on the Super Nintendo. And they're a lot closer together. On the SNES one, we've got some pretty big gaps. In the arcade one, there's rarely a point where you have a gap. And then for that last pillar there, that last column, it's offset vertically from the others. So it's harder to take out the faces on it because you have to move your ship around. Now here we have a Moai head mini-boss. This is not in the Super Nintendo version at all. This is an arcade exclusive. If you get here without your power-ups, this thing is insanely difficult. Even with all your power-ups, it's not a cakewalk, it's not easy. You still have to pay very close attention and watch where all those little bubbles are shooting out. And then when we get to the, boss proper here in just a moment, it is dramatically different in each. So here we are going towards the boss in the arcade, and the boss of the arcade one is 6 sort of medium-sized Moai heads mounted at different angles, including 4 that are weird diagonal angles. And as you shoot the little tiny Moai heads that they shoot out, they get bigger and expand. And they are sort of heat-seeking, they will make a path to your ship, and it is hard to avoid the big ones. The hitbox on the big ones is really something. It's really rather large. So you gotta be super careful on here. Had I been thinking, I would have put on my vertical shot, because it's a lot easier to do this part with the vertical shot than it is with the laser. As it is for all bosses in this game, if you just survive long enough, the boss fight will end. So now, I've unpaused it on the Super Nintendo. Here you can see we just have 2 giant Moai heads. They still shoot out a bunch of little ones, but they don't blow up and expand and get really big. Instead, we have the ground shake and a bunch of rock debris falls from the ceiling. As long as you've got options, super easy, just position them above you and you can shoot any of the debris that falls down. Alright, and here is our next really big divergence. So in the arcade, we're up to stage 6. I am showing you stage 10 for the Super Nintendo.
Force field.
So stage 10 for the Super Nintendo is the last stage, but they took part of this stage from the arcade one and put it at the end. So the arcade sort of has these 2 parts that involve sort of, they call it the cell stage, where you have more organic stuff and the bacterions and everything. So we've got 2 stages of that in the arcade version, or at least parts of 2 stages. On the Super Nintendo, they crammed it all at the end. But you'll see why I put the Super Nintendo stage here in just a moment. It is not identical to the arcade one, but it is much closer to it. And you can see we've got the meatballs with the claws on them. These things originally appeared in the very first Gradius game. And they were super annoying in that one. And you can see sometimes these things are just chugging on the Super Nintendo. Even with them not animating every single frame, things are still going ahead real slow. I do really like the music in the Super Nintendo one here. It also feels appropriate for a last level, which it is, so Konami really nailed the mood on it there. I like the song in the arcade one too, which is completely different, and it fits for its part of the game, where it's more of a middle stage than an end stage. And in the arcade version of the game, Konami just really loved to stuff people in these really tight corridors, and then put things at the end that you gotta blast immediately. We don't see nearly as much of that on the Super Nintendo. And you can see on the Super Nintendo, it's probably a lot more reminiscent now of like the first stage of Life Force than it is in the arcade version of Gradius III. There's a lot of differences here. And those little bubbles coming up and down from the ceiling, those are in stage 2 of the arcade version of Gradius III. But I forgot to mention that we don't see these little bubbles in the bubble stage of the Super Nintendo version of Gradius III. On the Super Nintendo, they only show up here in the cell stage. We got more of that classic Gradius / Life Force disappearing, reappearing gunk as you shoot it. It's interesting that on the Super Nintendo they included a full parallax background, while in the arcade one they went with a star field. So one thing that's really interesting is there is another version of Gradius 3 that had been shown at an arcade show, and it is in the new Gradius collection that's available for modern consoles, that just came out in the year 2025. And that one has a few different stages also, and things in a different order. So it's quite a bit different in some parts. And that includes some backgrounds. Like the sand stage in that version of Gradius 3, the arcade one, has this really awesome like nebula-looking background that they took out, you know, of the regular full release that came out after that arcade trade show. Which is too bad because it looked really nice. Now this boss is only in the arcade version of Gradius 3. He is not replicated on the Super Nintendo one at all. I think it's plain to see why. There's so much going on here with so many sprites. There's no way they could have even attempted this. The amount of flicker and slowdown that would have been present would have made even trying, you know, just a pointless endeavor. And then on top of all that, he shoots out even more segments. Sometimes he shoots out 2 arms. And then you won't get to see it here, but he pulls himself, you know, towards the center point of, you know, the 1 or 2 arms that are stretched out to try and smash itself into the ship. So this boss, if you don't stay on top of him, you know, he can get really hard really fast. As long as you're fully powered up and you have, you know, good firepower, you know, good lasers, he's not too bad, but he can get pretty rough. Alright, so now as we move on past that stage, for the arcade we are on stage 7, for the Super Nintendo we are on stage 5. And the arcade is going to name some stages weird a little bit after this, so you'll see what I mean and I'll point it out, but these are the fire stages in both versions of the game. They're equivalent. This is one of the most insane levels ever conceived for an arcade game in the history of the medium. As you destroy the fireballs, they break into 3 smaller fireballs that then break into more smaller fireballs still. The smaller fireballs they break into are invincible. You can't destroy them. Meanwhile, on the Super Nintendo, the fireballs break into 3 small ones and then they just explode. The Super Nintendo one is dramatically easier. This game in the arcade, you know, just seems almost impossible to survive. I had to use save states at like 3 points in this level to get myself through it. I have beaten this game, you know, without them before, but it is really hard, and that was a long time ago. So for playing it now, you know, I don't mind using save states, especially when I'm recording videos like this, to make this as efficient as possible. So I just want to really stress that if you're going to play this game, you're going to have a bad time on this stage. It's going to take a lot of practice to get through it without dying. And you may just think, well, what if I just don't shoot the big fireballs? Well, that's an option, but if you don't do that, then there's no slowdown, and when there's no slowdown, this game moves super fast, and it's really easy to get hit by things. So it's a choice you can make. But I've found that, you know, even though there's a lot less stuff on screen if you choose not to shoot the fireballs, it's still easier if you do shoot them and, you know, create all this fire and everything. Now, I will say on the Super Nintendo, I think the colors are a lot nicer and the fire looks way better. But I do miss the bubbling lava. If you look at the ceiling and floor of the arcade game, that lava bubbles. While on the Super Nintendo one, it just stays flat and it doesn't do anything. And we're going to see another pretty big divergence here. In the arcade, we've got 2 bosses on this part. So the first one is this big dragon thing, I forget its name. Gotta shoot its heart. It only opens its heart to you every now and then. And it goes around wasting a lot of your time. And then after you take out this first form of the boss, which I will do in just a moment, it launches into a second form, which is a big 2-headed dragon that looks a lot like the thing from Salamander / Life Force. Oh, this just takes forever because he keeps his stupid chest closed for too long. You can kill him faster. I missed a bunch of shots when he was up above me. That's why that one took a little bit longer than it should have. But here he is, and you can see it looks a lot like the Salamander / Life Force boss. You know, it's made of fire. It does rings around you. It shoots fireballs at you. Meanwhile, on the Super Nintendo, we can see this doesn't have the fire. It just looks more scaly. And just overall, it doesn't look nearly as cool. And there's a way more flicker on there. Way more flicker. A lot more slowdown. They did keep the part where if you shoot off one head, it reverses course and starts going backwards. We'll see that right there in the arcade one, too. And there we are, done in the arcade, done on the Super Nintendo. Now we're up to Stage 8 in the arcade and Stage 6 on the Super Nintendo. After that really intense, super hard stage, we're going to move into one that is way easier. So with this one, we're getting into the plant zone. The plant zone, the stage part of it's easy. The boss is a little tough in the arcade, and it's super easy on the Super Nintendo. But we'll talk about him when we get to him. Now, this is one of my favorite songs in the game, definitely top 3 out of the music here. And I haven't talked a lot about the music. The music in Gradius 3 is awesome. It's got a fantastic soundtrack. It's got some of the best songs in the series, easily. It's part of the reason that it's annoying that it's packed behind this game that's got so many other issues with the difficulty and the slowdown, and then on the Super Nintendo some additional flicker and stuff too. But this song is fantastic. But I think the best ones are the main Stage 3 song, the first part of it that plays when you're in the mountainous area, this song here, and then probably the song for the last level. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but Stage 9 in the arcade version, if you thought the fire stage was Garbo in the arcade, holy cow, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's got just some of the most ridiculous BS that I've ever seen in any shooter ever, and anyone who knows the game knows exactly what I'm talking about before I even mention it. But I don't want to spoil anything, so if you're new to it, you'll see it when you get there. And on this playthrough, it's going to look like it's not that big a deal and like it's nothing. But if you play the game in real life, it's going to be a lot different. Again, we've got some intense and irregular slowdown in both versions. You'll see parts of the game where it speeds up and then slows back down or jitters. The Super Nintendo one seems to, suffer from that a lot more, where it gets really jittery, where it's fast and slow, then fast and slow. And then you can see in the arcade, we've got 4 of the arms going on, plus a whole bunch of ships, plus a whole bunch of bullets. On the Super Nintendo, they keep things a lot more sane with the amount of sprites and stuff on the screen. So here's our boss in the arcade one. We'll pause them right there because they don't enter in quite the same way in both versions. And I want to keep this as equivalent as I can. Here is in the Super Nintendo. So this is another thing where it looks like they reused at least part of the graphic and then redrew it only slightly, gave it touch-ups for the Super Nintendo, and it looks like it's more stretched out. The other thing is, which you'll see in a moment here, it's animated like the face, for lack of a better term, is animated fully in the arcade version, while it is mostly still in the Super Nintendo one, like the texture doesn't animate. And in the arcade, it's got this other batch of like vines that are above and below it that block, being able to hit its weak spot, thing that sucks you in. And you got to have at least 2 speeds here if you want to survive this fight. So if you are a fan of going through Gradius games with just 1 speed power-up, can't do that with this one. You're going to have at least 2 for 2 parts of the game, and this is one of them. And there he is, taken out in both versions of the game. And now Stage 9 is exclusive to the arcade version. We don't have anything like it on the Super Nintendo. So after we have sort of the bonus area here, I'm going to pause that one, and then we'll make the arcade game full screen while we do that. And a lot of the bonus areas, enemy patterns and stuff are different in both versions also. They don't even really translate that the same. Now here we go. This is the Crystal Stage. I forget what it's called, Crystal Maze or something like that. You guys can look that up on your own if you want. Doesn't really matter to me. The point is, it's a bunch of crystals. The first part of the stage, it looks like Tetris pieces headed straight for your face. And then through these, a bunch of little, gun emplacements show up. And it is easy to get cornered here and stuck in places where you have no choice but to die. So you've got to be very careful and really keep your eye on the shape of those pieces and where they're landing. And they come by super fast, so you won't always have time to, really dodge and get out of the way efficiently.
Force field.
And believe it or not, we're almost at the end of this level, so you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, I thought you said this was hard and had one of the worst parts ever. Oh, we're just about to get up to it. You ain't seen nothing yet, folks. Alright, so here we are coming up to the end of it. This part here, completely insane. These cubes irregularly just go after you. Some make a beeline for you when they're in front of you. Some make a beeline for you after they get behind you. Some when they're on top. It's impossible to know which one's going to go where. And the amount of trial and error and luck that you've got to do to get through this part is insane. It's going to look easy here. You're going to think this is nothing. But I probably died like 30 times while recording this part and had to keep using save states. That's an exaggeration. I didn't die that many times. I think I died about 6 times on here. And I had to save state it in like 3 different spots again to get through it. And again, I have made it through this part without dying before, but it is next to impossible. The idea here is you have to build a little wall that will shield you, but you're still not shielded from the ones that come above you or from behind you. So you've got to maneuver, a couple of things into place here. And you see where I am right now? If I stay there, as soon as this section ends, I'm dead. Because the screen scrolls forward just a tiny little bit, which Konami did just to kill people that thought they were safe after all of that. It might have looked like nothing, but trust me, if you've never done that before, it is going to wreck you. You're going to die a lot. So if you're on an emulator, you can do save states. If you're playing some versions of the game, like on Gradius 3 and 4 for the PlayStation 2, they have some other things you can do to make that game a little bit easier and a little bit more fair. And then this boss here is only in the arcade version. He does not make an appearance on the Super Nintendo. It's not really all that hard. I mean, it's similar to a bunch of other bosses, as you can see. It's just the moving arms that are the, the one wrinkle and things there. So now let's go to the Super Nintendo with its exclusive stage, which will be stage 7 in this version of the game. And this, if you're a big Life Force / Salamander fan, will bring back memories of stage 5 in that game, where you have enemies that just, rush at you in those straight horizontal lines like that, and they just hit you in lines from top to bottom. That's not the only thing that's going to remind you of another game. Watch this. This is a take on the Speed Zone in Gradius 2. I don't think the layout's the same. It's been a while since I've played that one. Probably since I did the comparison between the arcade and PC Engine versions. But regardless, it's a similar kind of stage. So it's a speed zone. We've got the poles that open and close that you got to be careful about getting through. And this seems just like a kind of a way to make up for, not getting Gradius 2 on the Super Nintendo. There was a Famicom version, which was really good, and I've shown that on the channel before also, and I'll link both of those in the description, the Famicom version and the PC Engine versus arcade videos. Music here is alright. It's not one of the best songs in the game. One other thing I should mention here, just in case somebody wants to comment on it and point it out, on the Super Nintendo, aside from the game itself already being easier, you can do a variation of the Konami code to get powered up in it. So you can't do the normal up, up, down, down, left, right, BA. You have to do up, up, down, down, L button, R button, L button, R button, BA. If you do it without using the L and R button, if you use directions on the pad, your ship immediately explodes because Konami thought that would be a hilarious gag. But if you do the other one, you will get fully powered up. Alright, then as we head into the next part here, this is where stage numbering gets weird. In the Super Nintendo, this is a brand new stage, and look at all the extra power-ups there, and the things don't shoot at you and they're smaller. Meanwhile, in the arcade, this is considered the end of the crystal stage. So the boss rush is part of the same stage. And here we have, one of the life force bosses. And you can see I keep things going on the Super Nintendo here just for a little bit. That's so that, we have things lined up better in that one. Now, I should note here, you might be wondering, well, why aren't you showing me the Super Nintendo version of this? There is no Super Nintendo version of this. This boss is not in that one. The boss rush in the arcade features 6 bosses. The boss rush on the Super Nintendo only features 5, and this is the one they eliminated. And if you've seen this dude before, you take him out the same way in every version of this game. You blow up the little things in front of the eye, and then you blow up the eye. Now in the arcade, you can also see as we go on, there's sort of like a moon or something that we're above. It has craters and the bosses come out of it. Meanwhile, on the Super Nintendo, they all just come in from the right side of the screen. So this boss, which came to us from Gradius II, is boss 2 of 6 on the arcade and boss 4 of 5 on the Super Nintendo. So he comes near the end of the Super Nintendo version. Look how much better the animation is in the arcade. It is so much nicer looking for the little triangular sort of, shields that move around it. They are way less animated in the Super Nintendo one, much fewer frames. Alright, well, there's him taken out in both versions of the game. Now we're getting ready for our next boss. Boss 3 of 6 on the arcade, and boss 3 of 5 on the Super Nintendo. This is the only boss that has the exact same order number in both. Another one from Gradius II. It's interesting that the lasers are so much longer in the Super Nintendo one than the arcade one. It looks like there are fewer, but I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to pause it to count them, and I don't really feel like doing that. There he is, destroyed in both versions. So now we're headed up to boss 4 of 6 in the arcade version. Who will it be? Do you know Gradius fans? Yeah, another Gradius 2 boss. This crystal thing. Now this boss in particular, dramatically easier on the Super Nintendo version. Seems like it takes way fewer hits to kill. I took him out way faster in that one, which you'll see. I do like on the Super Nintendo that he's got his own, soundtrack, his own music. Should have noted that the prior boss on the Super Nintendo also had his own music. While in the arcade version, it pretty much just plays the Gradius II boss music throughout this entire part. We start out with the Life Force boss music, then the Gradius II boss music, and then the final boss, of the stage will have the normal Gradius III boss music. Meanwhile, on the Super Nintendo, there are a lot of exclusive songs for these bosses, where they get their own individual ones. Still going. Did I mention I don't like this boss? I mean, he looks awesome. He's always looked awesome. I remember that from seeing my first screenshots of it. Looks pretty nice in the Famicom / NES version. Or really just Famicom, since it never came out in the US of Gradius 2. Alright, here we go. Hit our next boss of the arcade, which is going to be boss number 5 of 6. Meanwhile, this boss is the first one in the boss rush, on the Super Nintendo. His attack pattern, much easier. The missiles are way easier to dodge on the Super Nintendo. Way harder overall, in the arcade. There you go. We've taken him out on the arcade. We've almost got him here on the SNES. Boom. Destroyed. Let's go. Final boss for each one. Boss 6 of 6 on the arcade, boss 5 of 5 on the SNES. And while it looks similar at first, he's got a trick exclusive to the SNES game, and there it is. He folds up into a circle and rams you. Or tries to ram you. In the arcade, he doesn't do that. And then we do have where he opens his sort of flaps on an angle. He does that in both versions of the game. You saw it in the arcade. Here he is doing it on the Super Nintendo. And that's finally it. So now on the Super Nintendo, we're going to be heading into stage 9. While on the arcade, we're heading into the first part of stage 10, which is kind of divided into 3 parts. So I've put a designation on the screen so you'll know each time what I consider a different part. Now things are going to be a little bit crazy on the comparison here, because on the Super Nintendo, there are parts of stages 8 and 9 that show up in this single stage 10 area in the arcade. So there'll be a few parts where I zip back and forth between different stages on the Super Nintendo, and you'll see why. It's because those parts line up with the arcade version. And there's another one of the great songs in the game. In the arcade, they went for just a sort of metallic, plain old gray background, but they have the lights turn on and off. The Super Nintendo, everything has more of a blue hue. And on the arcade, we have multiple layers of scrolling on that stuff in the background, while on the Super Nintendo, we have only 2. And I'm going to guess the only reason they went with only 2 is because breaking everything up into individual raster layers and scrolling it, along with all the slowdown they already have, would have been a little bit too taxing, on the hardware. It would have caused things to slow down even more. But that's my guess. If I'm wrong, feel free to tell me. I'm not saying for sure it's that way. Alright, so here we go. This, on the Super Nintendo, it's the second part of Stage 9. This happens after you beat the boss of Stage 9. So I'm putting it here because this is where it lines up before you beat the boss of Stage 10 in the arcade. And you can see this pretty much syncs up exactly with this part, in the arcade, so that's why these are together. Another big difference between them, though, is on the Super Nintendo, just like those rocks in Stage 3, you can destroy these things if you hit them enough. In the arcade version, you can't destroy them. You can knock them out of commission, and if they're at the end of one of those little passageways and you have no way else to go, you're going to die. There's no way around them. Then I brought things back here on the Super Nintendo. So we have parts that are similar again. With this floor and ceiling, we have chunks that move in both versions. The movement patterns are not the same. You can see we have a fair amount of bullets on screen now on the Super Nintendo. Seems like they show more on this stage than they do in the others. The arcade is especially mean about some of these moving platforms. And then we're running up to another part here, where in the arcade it's got this section with little mini walkers, and there is no equivalent here on the Super Nintendo. So in the arcade, this is what I was talking about before. There are places where you have these little cubby holes you gotta duck in, and that makes you lose your shield, because it registers your shield as colliding with the background, and it just damages it a whole bunch of times until it goes away. And it might look like you can destroy those walkers, but I've never been able to. I'm not 100% sure you can't because it makes noise like you're damaging them, but I've never been able to destroy them. Alright, we're almost up to a point where we can catch up again. And you can see on both versions, this is why I took the vertical power up instead of the normal double. For some of those gun emplacements and the things where you have little enemy houses that launch them straight up and straight down, they're almost impossible to hit with regular double when there's so much scenery in the way. But when you have vertical, you can do it, and it makes getting through this stage a lot easier. Now this part in the arcade is another one that is completely insane. I'm going to go through it here without dying, and I didn't die on my original playthrough. I didn't use any save states here. It's going to look easy, but it's not. There are times here where you will die and not make it through, and you'll have no idea how you could ever make it through. I remember watching a lot of videos of this back in the day to see how people maneuvered around it, and it is not easy. I feel like sometimes the movement pattern is not always timed exactly the same, and it can lead to situations where it's a lot tougher to navigate it, if not impossible. Alright, so now in the arcade we're sort of getting up to the boss here, after having gone through what I would consider the second part of the stage, which was the walkers and the beams and everything. Boss looks similar in both, except, oh look at that, no moving platforms on the Super Nintendo. So that difference alone makes the Super Nintendo one much easier. In the arcade, you've got to kind of stay close to him in the front, you know, and you'll take some hits to your shield if you're not careful. You got to make sure if you're playing this on your own that you go and take out all those guns first thing. Otherwise, you're going to have a bad time here. Alright, and for the arcade, that's the end of what I'll call Stage 10 Part 2. And we're going to enter Stage 10 Part 3, which includes a really big walker. So here on the Super Nintendo, I'm flashing back to the second part of what would be Stage 9 here. And look at this walker in the arcade. It's unlike any other ones that have appeared in other Gradius games. What you gotta watch mainly is what direction it's moving in, rather than just if it's picking its foot up, or the foot that you're closest to. Meanwhile, on the Super Nintendo, we get a completely different walker, and one that you can actually destroy. These look a little bit more like the small walkers that we saw in the earlier section in the arcade. And you can blow them up, as you can see there. You'll get one, and a second one will come up right away. Meanwhile, in the arcade, after you get past that walker, there's nothing. You get a little break where there's no enemies at all. And you might think, oh, I must be headed to the end. But nope, you are not. We still have one of the worst parts of the game to go through. It's what I'll call the third worst part of the game. Although I could easily see elevating it to the worst, because it's right before the end. So this is affectionately referred to as the meatballs in the arcade. So you've got these invincible meatballs that move up and down with this regenerating scenery you can destroy. The hitbox on the meatballs is nuts. You will die from getting just even slightly close to them. So you've got to keep yourself, you know, as far away from them as you can. Meanwhile, on the Super Nintendo, for the equivalent area, there's nothing like the meatballs. It just goes with a big area where you've got to shoot through, you know, a bunch of the gunk in the scenery. And you've got to get through a lot more of it than you do at any point in the arcade version of Gradius 3, and it's really more of a callback to Salamander/Life Force. Alright, now in the arcade we are finally headed toward the end game. The only thing we have left is the final boss. Same deal, we're headed there now on the Super Nintendo, but a little bit faster. The final boss looks mostly the same in both versions. The animation of the brain matter is a little bit different. The shrieking souls, I guess, that make up the foreground are quite a lot different. I'll shut up so you can listen to him now.
Out of the greediness of mankind. While many live, so will I.
Gee, what a profound sentiment. Now on the Super Nintendo, we are done. Meanwhile, in the arcade, we've got a high-speed escape. This is the only high-speed part of this game. And if you don't have, at minimum, 2-speed power-ups, you can't do this. I put myself as far front of the screen as I could with 2. Really, you want to have 3 here to make this easier, but then it gets, like I said, easier to smash into the scenery. It's another thing that I made look real easy there, and I didn't die on it or use save states on it, but it is very easy to die on it, and I have died on it many times before. Alright, here we are with The endings. There's a bit of similarity, but for the most part, you know, the concepts are similar, but the execution is quite a lot different. And then finally we get up to the credits. The ending music is completely different on the Super Nintendo than it is in the arcade. And I think I really vastly prefer the arcade ending music to the SNES ending music. And here is the Super Nintendo ending music. Went for a completely different kind of feel. So while this is finishing up and just before I do my overall wrap up, I'll just talk a little bit about both games together here. So for the arcade version, one of the hardest, horizontally scrolling shoot 'em ups I've ever played in my life. And I've played a lot of really hard ones. I mean, this game makes Polestar look easy. If you ever played Polestar on Neo Geo, that game's really hard. So you have to go into this one with the mindset, that you're going to die a lot, you're going to have to play it a lot to memorize where things are if you want to get good at it. The Super Nintendo one might seem really hard at first if you've never played it before, because some of the bullets come at you very fast, especially at the beginning. But if you stick with this one, it doesn't take much time at all to master it, and you've also got the, cheat code to power yourself up. And then for the ending here, on the Super Nintendo, if you don't play on hard, it tells you to challenge hard mode next if you beat it on easy or normal. If you beat it on hard, it tells you how to unlock the secret arcade. If you beat it on arcade mode, it gives you one of the strangest messages I've ever seen, which you're looking at right now. Alrighty, that is it. A complete playthrough of both the arcade and Super Nintendo versions of Konami's Gradius III. As to which game is better, it's hard for me to say definitively one way or the other. There are things I like better about the arcade game and things I like better about the Super Nintendo game. Now, the SNES version is a lot more fair to play through. It's not as insanely difficult as the arcade version, so it's easier to recommend for people just getting into the game. Master that one first, and then try your luck at the arcade game after you get really good at the SNES game. As far as visuals go, I'd say the arcade mostly looks a little bit better, but some of the colors are definitely nicer on the Super Nintendo, and it's nice to see a few of those extra parallax layers they threw in. When it comes to music, that one's a much tougher call. I like a lot of the music better in the arcade game than on the Super Nintendo. Some of the samples on the Super Nintendo version just aren't all that good, but some of them do sound good. Some songs are better in one version and some in the other. I guess what I'd really love to see is a more sanitized version of the arcade version of Gradius 3, with difficulty brought down from the stratosphere to a level that, people who are good at shooters but not absolute experts can enjoy more. Anyway, what do you guys think? Is this the first time you've seen the arcade version of Gradius 3 played all the way through? Are you an expert on the Super Nintendo version? Which one of the two games do you like better? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can now do that on Patreon or Ko-fi, as well as right here on YouTube through things like Super Thanks and channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.